I'm addressing the issue of a possible war in Ukraine. Some would even say a probable war in Ukraine. Of course, there's been fighting there for about 8 years since Russia invaded Luhansk and Donbass, those easternmost regions, and seized the Crimean Peninsula, all of which is Ukrainian sovereign territory. And Russia still recognizes Luhansk and Donbass as Ukrainian sovereign territory, despite the fact that Russia's been illegally occupying it for 8 years and lying every single day about its troops being there. And besides Russian troops being there, even Moscow acknowledges Russian volunteers have gone to Luhansk and Donbass to fight, and the Russian government doesn't even pretend to have made the slightest effort to stop them. And anyone who is fighting illegally surely is a terrorist. Even the Russian government, they deny having provided weapons, intelligence, and funding, and so on, for these unlawful fighters. And if Russia isn't funding them, isn't providing the weapons, who is then? So, not being the least bit Russophobic, there's nothing bad about being Russian or good being about any nationality. It's not good to be my nationality or Ukrainian or Russian. No nationality is good, no nationality is evil. Just telling the plain truth that the Russian regime is responsible for this. Not that all Ukrainians are entirely innocent. Anyway, so President Biden and he spoke to the Ukrainian president on the 13th of February for an hour. That's Volodymyr Zelensky. So the leaders, they've agreed to continue pursuing their twin track approach, desperately striving to avert war, which is diplomacy but also deterrence. The threat of swinging sanctions against Russia and arming Ukraine. I think not enough armaments have been delivered. And the United States has underscored yet again that it recognizes Crimea as Ukrainian soil. Now, if Russia, if you believe you have some claim to Ukraine, put it to the United Nations. You might not get your way, and that's how the United Nations works. So Putin has treated the United Nations as irrelevant to this and just seized it illegally, just like Russia's been illegally occupying some of Moldova and Georgia for years, and indeed denying it. So anyway, Biden, he underscored to the Ukrainians that if Russia does begin a full-scale invasion, then he will hit back with ruinous sanctions. Now, even he hasn't claimed that he'll send Russia back to the dog days of the 1990s with hyperinflation, with mass unemployment, people who even had jobs weren't paid for months and so on, just misery. Of course, that's trifling compared to what the grief that Russia went through in the 20th century, with the First World War and the Civil War and man-made famines when the Soviet regime deliberately starved several millions of its people to death. Some of the Ukrainians commemorate the Holodomor and happened in Kazakhstan and so on. Russia's very miffed about this. Hello, Kevin Canavan. Now, obviously, Russians were starved to death by their own government as well. And Russia's tried to has banned Memorial, this human rights organization, which tells a plain truth about Russian history and the history of other former Soviet countries, that the Soviet regime practiced state terrorism at an absolutely gargantuan scale, deliberately killed millions of its people, sent tens of millions to slave labor camps, 50% of whom had no trial whatsoever. The others often had a totally unfair trial with no defense counsel, with no ability to prepare a defense, tried in front of police officers, not a judge, no jury, and so on. No right of appeal, often held incommunicado for years in a slave labor camp, some of whom survived and were released, though. So they've obviously criminalized telling the truth about Russian history in Russia, sadly. And obviously there are liberal-minded Russians who really don't like oppression, who don't like genocide, and don't want their government to do that to them again or to anyone else. So President Biden, he spoke to Putin on the 12th of February, and the White House, they haven't revealed the content of the call, but the tenor of it is negative. You know, the White House said that is not heartening what was said. So the U.S. National Security Advisor, well, there we go for paraplexis, is Jake Sullivan, someone I debated against at Oxford years ago. And he was a smart cookie even back then, a Rhodes Scholar, someone who might try and be president one day. Anyway, Jake Sullivan said that the Russian invasion could begin any day now. And this underlines just how urgent the situation is that he chose to make this statement on a Sunday, which is almost unprecedented. So it's all very dispiriting. There's been a massive Russian military buildup on their frontier with Ukraine, and indeed the Belarusian frontier with Ukraine. And they've done this and to obviously intimidate the Ukrainians and claiming they're not threatening war. Putin said that, Hitchin said that Putin would be mad to invade Ukraine. Well, Putin is mad because the sanctions has cost his country at least $160 billion over the last year. Then there's the additional military spending. Their counter-sanctions has obviously hurt the Russian economy too, as well as hurting the economies of European Union countries and the United States and so forth. And it's all totally avoidable. They used to have a very cordial relationship with Ukraine even in the late 90s. Then he tried to murder a Ukrainian president, Lukashenko, poisoning him. He narrowly survived. I think it doesn't come to war. I still think Putin may annex the Donbass region. Well, the Russian parliament is mulling over whether to recognize Donbass as an independent country. They've done so with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and have an embassy in South Ossetia and Abkhazia and so on. Transnistria, they're not actually recognized. So that would be an unfriendly and a hostile act. But yeah, as I say, they had brotherly relations with the Ukraine to the late 90s. Ukraine began to properly democratize. Putin wasn't having that. Do I think he'll be ousted? No, but he's wondering when he can retire. And he was thinking, did he have a retirement job lined up? He was going to be somehow leader of the Union state between Belarus and Russia. He's not even managed to make that become a reality, despite, in fact, in 1999, President Lukashenko and Yeltsin agreed on the long-term goal of full reunification. Still hasn't happened. But he saw what happened with Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan. Nazarbayev had himself granted the title leader of the nation, which he holds for life. You were in Kiev before COVID, they're selling loo roll with Putin's face in everywhere. Exactly. And he's so alienated Ukraine permanently. Georgia's a tiny country, only 3 million people. Why on earth would they attack a superpower like Russia? Neither countries want to see their troops coming back home in body bags. Well, Ukraine definitely didn't start this war. They're fighting to defend their own territory. And they've even had to tolerate the loss of about 10% of their own land. And the Minsk Accords, which the Ukrainians say that Russians have failed to honour, but Russia doesn't even tell the truth about it. Why on earth has Russia even signed a peace agreement about Ukraine if Russia isn't fighting there? Because they are fighting there. There's all this double-think, this double-speak. If it's something to do with you, then stop commenting on it, saying, oh, it was an internal conflict. Well, it is true there's some Ukrainian citizens who are pro-Russian, who are ethnically Russian and so on. And it's not very clear who's who. And there's some ethnic Ukrainians who can only speak Russian, but there are not many of those left these days. And just because you speak Russian doesn't mean that you are Russian ethnically or in any other sense. Language and nationality are not the same thing. And I know they're often connected, though. And Moscow doesn't like the way that Ukraine has made Ukrainian the sole official language, but they only did that because they were aggressed by Russia. The British and American intelligence have said Russia's planning a false flag operation to kill lots of civilians in Ukraine, ethnic Russian civilians, and blame it on the Ukrainians. They've done this kind of thing before with the apartment block bombings in 1999, where Putin, when he was prime minister, deliberately murdered hundreds of his own citizens as a pretext to restart the conflict in Chechnya, where again thousands of civilians were killed, often deliberately killed. No mistake, not collateral damage. Anyways, it was all very dispiriting. The United States, Canada, Israel, United Kingdom, many other countries have evacuated all their non-essential diplomats, urged their citizens to depart Ukraine whilst they still can. So the United States has deployed another 3,000 troops to Poland. So the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he's going to Ukraine. I think it's tomorrow, going to Russia, see if they can do something to avoid war. So the European Union said they've got these sanctions ready to go. So Russia might not go for a full invasion, might not have that thrust at Kiev, might just take a little bit more land, thinking there won't be a proper response, probably telling flagrant lies. No, we're not invading, just like they did with Ukraine, and then boasted that they had invaded, or that they would say liberated. The European Union has indicated the financial and energy sectors will be hit, but Western sanctions need to be hard. So often they've been too soft, went too easy on Russia, and Boris Peskov, who's Putin's press secretary, said sanctions targeting Putin personally would be a step too far. Why? He started this totally unnecessary illegal war. You say, yeah, what about Iraq, Afghanistan? Afghanistan was subject to a United Nations Security Council resolution that Russia voted for. And Russia even facilitated that by persuading Central Asian countries to let NATO countries use their air bases. And as for Iraq, that's pursuant to UN Security Council resolutions that Russia voted for. I know there's some dispute over the interpretation of those resolutions, but the United States never claimed an inch of Iraq for itself. They indeed withdrew from Iraq when they no longer had an agreement with the Iraqis, and they left behind a democracy, overthrew one of the cruelest genocidal regimes in the world. and Iraq is much, much better off. And yeah, a lot of people got killed in that conflict. I mean, that's what happened in an conflict. Many of them killed by Al Qaeda types, its Shia mirror images, Ba'athist remnants, and so on. And of course, US troops were not entirely innocent, did commit some war crimes there as well. Anyway, so Moscow vehemently denies any intention of invading Ukraine. Why on earth the massive military build-up for over 2 months, about 100,000 troops living in tents all this time? They've got troops to the north, to the east, and to the south, and obviously a lot of their warships in the Black Sea, so they could attack from 3 directions. Since the 10th of February, this joint military exercise has been going on in Belarus, between Russia and Belarus. But these war games could easily turn into an actual war, invading Ukraine. We shall see. So it's at very least it's an attempt to intimidate Ukraine and NATO into vowing that they shall never allow Ukraine to accede to NATO. But of course, it's absolutely wrong. Russia has no right to dictate the foreign policy or the domestic policy of another country, just like we can't dictate their foreign policy. Their domestic policy is not like they're doing something appalling the Ukrainians, though obviously there are imperfections, there is corruption, but they're striving to make it better, a proper democracy, which is another mortal peril to the Putin kleptocracy. Imagine if Ukraine was a highly successful democracy. Look at Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, a higher per capita GDP than Russia. And because they're not such unequal societies, the average person in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia is much better off. The Lithuanian president just warned, don't think that Putin is bluffing. He really does intend to invade Ukraine. And she's worried because about 25% of her citizens are ethnically Ukrainian. At least she's in NATO. And Putin would say, oh, the much put upon Russian ethnic minority in Lithuania, I must go and liberate them. So this will be their salvation. Now, he probably won't do that because it's a NATO country, but I think NATO should have sent 100,000 troops to Russia's border, begin flying just off their airspace, sailing just outside their territorial waters. Russia just accused the US Navy of sending a submarine into its territorial waters off the Kuril Islands. The US government says that's a lie. Now, I know who's more likely to be telling the truth. It's the United States, of course. Not that the government never lies. It does lie, but it's the Russian government. It just lies almost all the time. So US and Russian generals have been in touch, trying to avert the kind of misunderstanding which could lead the two to fighting at each other directly. Anyway, so Israel really strives to have cordial relations with Russia. The fact that even they pulled their non-essential diplomats out of Kiev tells you something. So, I mean, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, is saying, hey, cool it. Don't assume that war is inevitable. I suppose he just doesn't want to cause a panic in his country. And this will impact the European Union. There are 40 million people in Ukraine, and millions of them will be stampeded into the European Union as refugees if their country is wrecked. And some people are dispirited to say that the Russian military could reach Kiev in 48 hours. I'm no military man. Well, I hope the Ukrainians are prepared adequately. I don't know what you do. Do you dig anti-tank trenches? Russia would likely try and avoid urban centres. They've always had difficulty in city centre fighting. They've got much greater firepower, but they would suffer some serious losses. We shall see. But, you know, the pundits can be wrong. Remember Afghanistan this August, people predicting that the Afghan government will be able to fight on for a further 6 months, maybe even a couple of years, but they fell even before the United States had fully withdrawn. Anyway, there are a few wildcard factors. These things are a bit unpredictable. I don't think Putin will go so far as to try and conquer the whole of Ukraine, but a bigger chunk and try and negotiate, well, I'll give you this land back in return for this, is always a quid pro quo with him. So that's it. I mean, I'm very fortunate to live in peace. I'm very glad that I live far from that frontier, and I do feel terribly sorry for the Ukrainians. But if he gets away with this, who's next? Why not conquer the whole of Georgia or something like that? He's been very open about his darkest fantasy of rebuilding the Soviet Union, and we know that he's a sawdust Stalin for today. So it just shows you that evil quite often prospers. That's enough. Thank you for watching my channel. Okay,